Good evening, everyone. Tonight we'll step into a world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets, where the scent of honeysuckle drifts on the evening air and the chime of the church clock marks not just the passing hours, but sometimes the unfolding of a mystery. It's a place where appearances deceive and truth often hides behind lace curtains, waiting patiently to be discovered by a keen eye and an understanding heart. Prepare yourself for a journey into the unexpected, where the ordinary conceals the extraordinary, and the most commonplace objects can hold the key to a puzzling enigma. Now let us begin with Chapter 1 of the piano that played by itself. Chapter 1. The Arrival at Willow Creek Manor. The late afternoon sun of early spring cast long, dappled shadows across the lanes of St. Mary Mead. It was a time of year when the village seemed to sigh contentedly, shaking off the last vestiges of winter's chill to embrace the promise of warmer days. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her window, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythmic, almost meditative cadence, observed the world with a gentle but exceptionally sharp gaze. Her eyes, the color of faded forget-me-nots, missed nothing. The new growth on the rose bush outside, the hurried step of Mrs. Gamp heading to the shop, or the subtle shift in the social currents of the village. It was this latter observation that had occupied much of St. Mary Mead's attention for the past fortnight, the arrival of the new inhabitants at Willow Creek Manor. The manor, a grand, slightly imposing house on the outskirts of the village, had stood empty for several years since the passing of old Mr. Abernathy, a reclusive scholar known more for his dusty books than his social graces. Now it had been purchased by the Fairweathers, Mr. Alistair Fairweather, a retired tea merchant from London, and his wife, Mrs. Eleanor Fairweather, a woman described by early callers as delicate and somewhat nervous. They were accompanied by their niece, Miss Clara Meredith, a young lady of vibrant spirit who, it was hoped, would bring some much-needed life to the old house. The village had, of course, been abuzz with speculation. What would they be like? Would they join the church fete committee? Were they truly as wealthy as the size of the manor suggested? And, most importantly, would they bring an end to the unsettling whispers that had long clung to Willow Creek, tales of strange shadows and unexplained noises, mere superstition to Miss Marple, but potent fuel for the local imagination? The Fairweathers had brought with them a substantial amount of furniture and personal effects, carted down from London in a series of large, cumbersome wagons. One particular item had drawn the most attention from the village children, who had gathered at a respectable distance to watch its laborious unload: a magnificent, dark wood, grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the spring sky. It was a beautiful instrument, clearly old and of significant value, and it took 4 burly men from the village to maneuver it through the manor's wide front doors. Quite a piece, isn't it? Mrs. Gamp had remarked to Miss Marple over the garden wall a day after its arrival. Heard it's an antique. Mrs. Fairweather herself supervised its placement in the drawing-room, apparently. Said it was essential. Miss Marple merely hummed, her needles not faltering. A grand piano can indeed be the heart of a drawing-room, Mrs. Gamp. Provides a certain resonance, wouldn't you say? The resonance, however, proved to be more literal than anyone could have predicted. It began subtly a few evenings later. The rector's wife, Mrs. Clement, mentioned it first during a committee meeting for the annual harvest festival. Such a shame, really, for the Fairweathers, she'd begun, her brow furrowed. Poor Mrs. Fairweather has quite the headache, she told me this afternoon. And it's no wonder with the house settling and all the peculiar noises. She paused as if weighing her words. Mr. Clement and I were walking past Willow Creek last night, rather late, after visiting old Mr. Henderson, you see. And we both distinctly heard music. A ripple of curiosity ran through the small gathering. Music, Mrs. Clement? Inquired Miss Weatherby, ever the skeptic. Perhaps Miss Meredith plays the piano. A charming accomplishment. Mrs. Clement shook her head, a worried expression on her face. No, that's just it, dear. It wasn't a planned piece, not a practice. It sounded quite disjointed, and rather faint, as if played by a ghost of a touch. And what's more, she lowered her voice conspiratorially, the lights in the drawing-room were entirely out. Miss Marple's needles paused, suspended for a fraction of a second. The delicate elderly lady merely tilted her head slightly, her gaze thoughtful. It was only the rector's wife's imagination, perhaps, given the manor's reputation, but Miss Marple filed the observation away. It was a curious thing, music from an unlit, newly occupied house. The following evening brought a similar account, this time from Colonel Bantry, who lived directly opposite Willow Creek. He mentioned it to his wife, Dolly, at supper, grumbling good-naturedly. "Heard a frightful caterwaul last night, Dolly. Sounded like a cat on the piano keys. Thought the Fairweathers might be having a spot of trouble getting settled." But then it stopped as abruptly as it began. Most peculiar, considering they retired early, according to Perkins, their new gardener. Dolly Bantry, accustomed to her husband's occasional dramatic flourishes, initially dismissed it. But then, as she was bidding good night to her spaniel, her attention was caught by a faint, almost ethereal melody, drifting from across the road. It wasn't a caterwaul, no. It was a simple, repetitive air, a nursery rhyme perhaps, played with a light, almost hesitant touch. The lights at Willow Creek Manor were indeed off, save for a single lamp glowing faintly in an upstairs bedroom. Dolly shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. The music continued for a few moments more, then ceased, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. The next morning the rumors had firmly taken root. Miss Marple, during her usual morning constitutional around the village green, observed a certain tightness in Mrs. Gamp's lips and a flurry of hushed conversations outside the bakery. She heard snippets of talk. The grand piano. By itself. And no one was even awake, they say. Later that day, Mr. Fairweather himself paid a visit to Miss Marple, ostensibly to introduce himself and offer a small basket of fresh eggs from his new chickens, but primarily, she suspected, to gauge the village gossip. He was a portly man with a kindly, rather flustered air about him. "My dear Miss Marple," he began, dabbing his brow with a handkerchief, "such a charming village. But I must confess my wife is a touch sensitive to the atmosphere. These old houses, you know. She's convinced she hears things. The piano, for instance. Says it plays by itself," he chuckled, a nervous sound. "Nonsense, of course. Drafts, perhaps? Or the pipe settling. Old Mr. Abernathy was quite eccentric, I hear. Left the place in a rather rustic state." Miss Marple offered him a cup of tea and a slice of her excellent seed cake. "Indeed, Mr. Fairweather, old houses have their own songs, don't they? And pianos, particularly old ones, sometimes hold memories. One might almost imagine they play on their own, don't you think?" Her gaze, however, was not on her teacup, but on the slight tremor in Mr. Fairweather's hand as he raised his own cup. He seemed too eager to dismiss the matter. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple sat once more by her window. The air was still, save for the distant hoot of an owl. And then, faintly at first, then growing a little clearer, she heard it. A simple, melancholic tune played with a distinct, deliberate touch, yet no more robust than a breath of wind. It was coming from Willow Creek Manor, and just as Mrs. Clement and Dolly Bantry had reported, the manor was bathed in darkness. There was no light in the drawing-room, no silhouette at the piano bench. The piano at Willow Creek Manor was playing by itself. Chapter 2, A House Full of Secrets. The inexplicable melodies continued to drift from Willow Creek Manor over the next few nights, growing bolder, more insistent. The villagers, initially amused or dismissive, began to feel an undercurrent of unease. Mrs. Gamp, who usually dismissed anything that couldn't be quantified in shillings and pence, confided in her sister-in-law that she'd heard a tune that sounded exactly like Greensleeves being played when she was certain every soul in the Fairweather household was abed. Miss Marple, while maintaining her serene exterior, observed the situation with increasing interest. Mr. Fairweather's initial dismissal had struck her as rather too emphatic, like a man trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Mrs. Fairweather's delicacy and nervousness also seemed to deepen with each passing night of the phantom music. She decided a casual visit was in order. One sunny afternoon, armed with a small basket of freshly picked plums from her garden, Miss Marple walked the winding path to Willow Creek Manor. The house itself was imposing, set back from the lane behind a sweep of overgrown lawns. Its windows, however, seemed to stare out blankly, offering little insight into the lives within. She was greeted by Mrs. Higgins, the new housekeeper, a woman with a perpetually anxious expression. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you. Mrs. Fairweather is in the drawing-room. She's not feeling quite herself today." Miss Marple was ushered into the very room from which the ghostly music had emanated. It was a large, elegantly furnished space, dominated by the magnificent grand piano. Its dark wood gleamed, reflecting the light from the tall windows. Mrs. Fairweather, a slight woman with pale features and dark, troubled eyes, sat on a settee. A lace shawl clutched around her shoulders despite the warmth of the day. Miss Clara Meredith, her niece, a striking young woman with auburn hair and a vivacious spirit, was attempting to cheer her aunt with a spirited rendition of a popular tune on a small gramophone in the corner. "Miss Marple, how lovely of you to call," Mrs. Fairweather said, her voice soft and reedy. "To forgive my state. This old house. It's rather trying on the nerves, I find." Clara paused the gramophone, rising with a bright smile. "Aunt Eleanor exaggerates, Miss Marple. It's a wonderful house, full of character. Though I admit these peculiar noises have given us all a bit of a turn." She lowered her voice slightly. "The piano, you see. It does seem to have a mind of its own." Miss Marple settled into an armchair, accepting a cup of tea. "Indeed, Miss Meredith, I hear tell it has been quite musical in the evenings." Her gaze drifted to the piano. "It was an exceptionally fine instrument, a Bechstein, perhaps, from the look of it. Its keys, a rich ivory, seemed to shimmer in the light." "It's simply dreadful," Mrs. Fairweather fretted, twisting her handkerchief. "Alistair says it's the wind, or the house settling, but I know what I hear. Last night it played that dreadful tune again, that old children's song. It's so unsettling." "Children's song, you say?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational. "Do you recall which one, my dear?" Mrs. Fairweather hesitated. "Oh, just one of those old ones. Rather wistful, I suppose. Alistair just laughs, of course, says I'm imagining things. But I know I'm not." A flicker of resentment crossed her features. Mr. Fairweather entered the room just then, having returned from a walk in the garden. He greeted Miss Marple warmly, then turned to his wife. "Still on about the ghostly pianist, Eleanor?" "Really, darling, it's nothing but the old wiring humming or a branch scraping against the house. We mustn't let village superstitions take root." He winked at Miss Marple, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Miss Marple merely sipped her tea. She noted the way Mrs. Fairweather flinched at her husband's dismissive tone, and the way Clara, though outwardly cheerful, exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance with her aunt. There was a tension in the room that had little to do with ghosts. Her gaze returned to the piano. She noticed a faint, almost invisible scratch on the polished wood near the pedals, as if something had been dragged across it. And near one of the decorative legs, a tiny, almost microscopic chip in the wood, as if a small, sharp object had struck it. Not unusual for an antique, perhaps, but Miss Marple's mind filed away even the most insignificant details. "Such a splendid instrument," Miss Marple remarked, rising to walk closer to it. She ran a gloved finger lightly along the keys. "Does anyone in the household play, Mr. Fairweather?" "Clara dabbles a little," he replied, with a dismissive wave of his hand, "though she prefers the gramophone, I believe. My wife cannot play a note, bless her heart. And I, alas, am entirely tone-deaf." He chuckled again, a little too loud. Clara smiled faintly. "I do play a bit, Miss Marple, but never that particular tune, and certainly never at dead of night." Her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held a flash of something unreadable. Fear, perhaps, or a deeper knowledge. Miss Marple turned from the piano, her expression serene. "Indeed. Well, I do hope the house settles for you soon, Mrs. Fairweather, and that the music, if it must play, chooses a more cheerful air." As Miss Marple took her leave, politely declining Mr. Fairweather's offer of a carriage, she walked slowly back down the drive. She reflected on the visit. Mr. Fairweather was trying too hard to appear unaffected. Mrs. Fairweather was genuinely distressed. But her distress seemed tinged with something more specific than mere fear of the supernatural. And Miss Clara Meredith, with her bright eyes, seemed to hold a secret she was unwilling to voice. But it was the piano itself that held her attention, not the faint scratches or chips, but something else, something very subtle, that her sharp eyes had picked up. There was a distinct, almost imperceptible line of dust, disturbed in a way that suggested something had been moved or dragged beneath the piano. It ran from the instrument's base towards the wall, and then seemed to disappear behind a large velvet curtain. The piano was not merely playing by itself. It seemed to be connected to something. Chapter 3. A Curious Mechanism. The persistent spectral music from Willow Creek Manor became the singular topic of conversation in St. Mary Mead. Theories abounded. Old Mr. Abernathy's ghost, a faulty mechanism within the antique instrument, or even a cunning prank by some local lads. Miss Marple, however, dismissed all but the possibility of a mechanism, though one, she suspected, not of the piano's original design. Her observations during her visit to Willow Creek had given her pause. The dust trail, the specific tune, a children's lullaby. It turned out one quite old and largely forgotten, and the distinct unease of the Fairweathers themselves. Mrs. Fairweather's agitation seemed to stem less from fear of ghosts and more from a tangible human anxiety. Miss Marple decided to confide in a trusted acquaintance, Dr. Haydock, the village physician, a man of science, but also a keen observer of human nature. She found him in his surgery, arranging his instruments with a methodical air. "Doctor," she began, after politely inquiring about his day, "I find myself pondering a rather unusual phenomenon at Willow Creek Manor." She recounted the tales of the piano music and her own observations. Dr. Haydock listened, stroking his chin. A fascinating case, Miss Marple. My initial thought would be a player-piano mechanism, perhaps, but those are generally quite elaborate and not easily mistaken for spontaneous playing." "And the Fairweathers made no mention of such a feature during the purchase, I gather?" "None whatsoever," Miss Marple confirmed, "and the music is described as hesitant, almost clumsy, which would not typically be the output of a precise mechanical player." "No, I believe it is a deliberate act, Doctor." "But how?" "A very good question," Dr. Haydock mused. "One could rig a series of strings to depress keys, perhaps from another room, or even an elaborate system of weights and pulleys. It would require ingenuity and a certain malicious intent if it is indeed to distress Mrs. Fairweather." "Malicious intent, or perhaps a desperate one," Miss Marple corrected softly. "But if so, what is the purpose of such an elaborate deception?" Her mind drifted back to the piano itself. She had also noticed briefly a slight discoloration on the floorboards directly beneath the instrument, as if something had been placed there for a long time, obscuring the original stain. And the velvet curtains, she recalled, were rather thick and hung unusually low, almost brushing the floor. The next day, during her afternoon tea, Miss Marple received an unexpected caller, Miss Clara Meredith. The young woman arrived looking pale and agitated, her usual vivacity dimmed. "Miss Marple," Clara began without preamble, her voice barely a whisper, "I don't know what to do. Aunt Eleanor is becoming quite ill with worry. She hears the music incessantly now, even during the day. And Uncle Alister. He is so dismissive, but I see the worry in his eyes, too. He won't admit it, but he paces at night." "My dear, please sit," Miss Marple urged, offering her a cup of tea. "And tell me, what precisely is troubling you?" Clara wrung her hands. "It's not just the music, Miss Marple. There's something else. Something I found. You see, I was trying to find some old sheet music for Aunt Eleanor. She loves the old sentimental tunes. And I happened to glance behind the piano. The curtain's there. They're very thick, you know. And I saw it." She lowered her voice further, her eyes wide. "There's a small, almost invisible gap between the wall and the skirting board, just behind where the piano stands. And through it I could see a thin, almost translucent fishing line stretched taut. It disappeared into the wall." Miss Marple's gentle gaze remained steady, but a spark of understanding flickered in their depths. "A fishing line, you say? And what was it attached to, my dear?" Clara shook her head, frustrated. "I couldn't tell. It was too dark. But it was definitely attached to something on the underside of the piano's keyboard, near the damper pedals, I think, in the way it vanished into the wall. It looked as if it was connected to another room entirely. Perhaps the study next door, which Uncle Alister keeps locked. This was it. The deliberate mechanism, the dust trail, the subtle discoloration, the thick curtains, and now The fishing line. Miss Marple's mind began to connect the threads, much like her knitting. An ingenious yet simple system. And the tune, Miss Meredith, Miss Marple pressed gently. The children's lullaby. Does it have any significance that you know of? Clara looked surprised. Why, yes, now that you mention it. It's an old song, almost forgotten. It was my mother's favorite. And it was also a favorite of Mr. Abernathy. Miss Marple paused, her teacup halfway to her lips. Old Mr. Abernathy? The previous owner of Willow Creek Manor? Yes, Clara confirmed. He was a distant relative of my mother's, a very distant one, and he adored that tune. My mother would often play it for him when she visited him as a child, before he became so reclusive. It's called Whispering Willows, a lullaby, a fishing line, a locked study, and a deceased, reclusive owner. The pieces were beginning to align. This was no simple haunting, and certainly no spontaneous melody. Someone was deliberately manipulating the piano, and the choice of tune was a highly significant personal message. Miss Meredith, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm, you have shown great courage in coming to me. I believe you have stumbled upon something far more serious than a mere prank. And I also believe that tune, Whispering Willows, holds a secret, perhaps one that Mr. Abernathy intended to be found. Does your uncle, Mr. Fairweather, know of this connection? Clara hesitated, her eyes darting nervously towards the window. He knows of the tune, of course, but he always dismisses it as Aunt Eleanor's fancy. But there's something else, Miss Marple, something that might explain why someone would go to such lengths. A few weeks before Mr. Abernathy passed away, he wrote a new will, and that will... It disappeared. Miss Marple placed her teacup back on its saucer with a delicate clink. The piano was not merely playing a lullaby, it was whispering a truth about a missing will. Chapter 4. The Missing Document. Clara Meredith's revelation about the missing will of old Mr. Abernathy transformed the curious case of the phantom piano music into something far more sinister. A will, Miss Marple knew, was a document that often brought out the very worst in human nature. Greed, resentment, and manipulation frequently danced around its clauses. A missing will, you say? Miss Marple repeated softly, her mind already working through the implications. And when did Mr. Abernathy make this new will, Miss Meredith? Just weeks before his death, as I understood it, Clara replied, her voice still hushed. My mother had mentioned it in a letter to me, saying that Mr. Abernathy had been visited by a solicitor from London and was quite pleased with his new arrangements. She suspected he intended to leave something substantial to charity, or perhaps to a long-lost cousin. He had no direct heirs, you see? And who was to be the primary beneficiary under his previous will, if you know? Miss Marple inquired. Why, Aunt Eleanor, of course, Clara said, a touch of surprise in her voice. Mr. Abernathy was distantly related to her family, and he always held a fondness for her. The old will, which was confirmed by the estate, left the bulk of his modest fortune and Willow Creek Manor to my aunt. My uncle, Mr. Fairweather, was rather pleased, though they only decided to move in after much deliberation. Aunt Eleanor was always a little nervous of the place. Miss Marple nodded. This added a layer of complexity. If the new will disappeared, then the old one would stand, making Mrs. Fairweather the inheritor. This would give Mr. and Mrs. Fairweather a very strong motive to ensure the new will was never found. But then why the piano music? Was it meant to frighten someone away from finding it? Or was it a desperate plea from a troubled conscience? And where was this new will kept, do you think? Miss Marple pressed. Clara shook her head. I have no idea. But Mr. Abernathy was a meticulous man. He wouldn't have simply misplaced it. It must have been carefully hidden or taken. And the solicitor who drafted it? I believe he retired shortly after Mr. Abernathy's death. His practice was absorbed by a larger firm in London, and tracing the specific details has been difficult for the estate lawyers, I gather. The plot thickened considerably. Miss Marple understood that the music, then, was not merely a prank or a ghost. It was a message, perhaps even a coded one, related to the missing will and the late Mr. Abernathy. The choice of tune, Whispering Willows, a favorite of the deceased and Clara's mother, suggested a deeper connection. Miss Meredith, Miss Marple advised, you must be very careful. Do not speak of the fishing line or the missing will to anyone else in the household. It would be unwise, and if you notice anything else unusual, anything at all, no matter how small, please come to me." Clara, looking thoroughly intimidated but also resolute, promised she would. She then departed, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The following days brought fresh developments, albeit subtle ones. The persistent music from Willow Creek Manor seemed to shift in its pattern. It was no longer just the lullaby. Occasionally, a single, sharp, discordant note would pierce the quiet evening, followed by a series of 3 distinct, light taps on the keys, then silence. This happened twice in one evening, according to Mrs. Gamp, who was now utterly convinced the manor was haunted. Then there was the incident of the missing brooch. Mrs. Fairweather had a beautiful antique brooch, a family heirloom, which she wore frequently. One afternoon, while visiting Mrs. Clement for tea, she discovered it was gone. She was distraught. "I must have dropped it at the manor," she wailed. "Or perhaps it fell off during my walk here." A frantic search of the manor, the gardens, and the lane yielded nothing. Mr. Fairweather was furious, accusing the new housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, of negligence, though there was no direct evidence. The brooch, however, was not found. Miss Marple heard of the incident with a keen ear. A valuable item suddenly missing from a household already fraught with tension. She couldn't help but think of the piano. Could the two be connected? The discordant note, the 3 taps, the missing brooch, the hidden fishing line, the missing will, and the lullaby. Miss Marple sensed a pattern emerging, like the intricate design of her knitting, stitch by careful stitch. That evening, as dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple observed a curious sight. A small, dark figure, seemingly Mr. Fairweather, was moving stealthily around the grounds of Willow Creek Manor, not in the formal garden, but near the old, disused shed at the back of the property, partially obscured by a thicket of overgrown bushes. He carried a small lantern, its beam occasionally flashing as he bent down, examining something on the ground. He seemed to be searching for something, not necessarily the brooch, but something else entirely. He moved with a furtive, anxious air, quite unlike his usual blustery manner, and then, as if on cue, the faint melancholic strains of Whispering Willows began to emanate from the manor's drawing-room. This time, however, it was punctuated by those 3 distinct, light taps on the keys. Mr. Fairweather froze, his head snapping towards the house. He extinguished his lantern with a suddenness that suggested panic, and melted back into the shadows, making his way back to the house with unusual haste. Miss Marple, hidden in the twilight of her own garden, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The piano was not merely playing by itself. It was playing a message, and someone at Willow Creek Manor was very clearly receiving it and reacting to it with a profound sense of alarm. Chapter 5. The Unexpected Visitor. The incident with Mr. Fairweather and the lantern, followed immediately by the piano's peculiar performance, solidified Miss Marple's conviction that the music was a deliberately crafted signal. The missing brooch, too, seemed to fit into a growing puzzle, though its exact relevance remained elusive. Miss Marple knew that, in such intricate deceptions, seemingly unrelated events often converged to reveal a larger truth. A few days later, a new element was introduced into the already tense atmosphere of Willow Creek Manor. An unexpected visitor arrived. A telegram had been delivered that morning, announcing the imminent arrival of Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy, a distant cousin of the late Mr. Abernathy, who had been living abroad for many years, and was only now returning to England. She was, according to her telegram, passing through, and wished to pay her respects to the former residence of her lamented cousin. The news caused a flurry of hushed conversations in the village. Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy was known, by reputation, to be a rather formidable woman, sharp-witted, and with a decidedly practical nature. Her unexpected appearance now, at a time when the manor was rife with secrets, struck Miss Marple as highly significant. Miss Clara Meredith, looking even more strained, paid another visit to Miss Marple, ostensibly to return a borrowed book. "Aunt Eleanor is quite beside herself," Clara whispered, once they were seated in Miss Marple's comfortable drawing-room. "She's afraid Mrs. Abernathy will think ill of the house or of us with all these strange goings-on." "And what does Mr. Fairweather say of this visit?" Miss Marple inquired, selecting a particularly fine purple yarn for her knitting. "He is less concerned with Mrs. Abernathy's opinion," Clara replied, a hint of bitterness in her tone, and more with her questions. "She is very direct, you see. She's already asked about the state of Mr. Abernathy's affairs, and whether his will was straightforward." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly. "A woman of definite purpose, it sounds." "And that's not all," Clara continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Last night the piano played again, but this time it was different. It played Whispering Willows twice, clearly, then those 3 taps, but then it played a much shorter, very distinct phrase, a series of 4 notes, repeated. I recognized it, Miss Marple. It's the opening phrase to an old hymn, Rock of Ages." Miss Marple's knitting paused again. A hymn, a children's lullaby, and a hymn. This was becoming more than just a message. It was a complex code. "And did anyone else notice this new tune?" Clara nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, mentioned it to me this morning. She said she'd never heard the piano play that before, and it gave her the shivers. She's thinking of giving notice, Miss Marple. She says the house is unnatural. The new tune, Rock of Ages, and the housekeeper's growing distress. Another layer." Miss Marple suspected that the Fairweathers themselves might not be the sole engineers of this charade, or at least that one of them was more deeply implicated than the other. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple, having secured an invitation through Mrs. Clement, went to Willow Creek Manor to pay her respects to the arriving Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy. She found the manor in a state of suppressed tension. Mrs. Fairweather, pale and fluttering, hovered near her husband, who seemed to be wearing a mask of forced joviality. Clara looked weary, her vibrant spirit noticeably dimmed. Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy, in contrast, was a woman of formidable presence. Tall and gaunt, with an air of steely intelligence, she surveyed the drawing-room with a critical eye. She had an almost hawkish nose and sharp, discerning eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Such a pity about dear Cousin Albert," she declared, her voice resonating through the room. "Though I confess he became quite the recluse in his later years. A shame. Always so bright as a young man." Her gaze swept to the grand piano. "Ah, the Bechstein. I remember Albert's father purchased that. A magnificent instrument. Does anyone play it? Pray tell." Mr. Fairweather cleared his throat. "Clara, my niece, dabbles a little, Mrs. Abernathy, but the piano has, shall we say, taken to playing itself of late. A rather quaint feature of this old house." He attempted a jocular laugh, but it fell flat. Mrs. Abernathy's sharp eyes fixed on him. "Playing itself, indeed? I find that rather difficult to believe, Mr. Fairweather, unless, of course, it is a player piano, which I recall it certainly was not in Albert's day." Her tone was cutting, leaving no room for dismissiveness. Clara, encouraged by Miss Marple's presence and Mrs. Abernathy's directness, spoke up. "We do hear it quite often, Mrs. Abernathy, sometimes late at night. A children's song, mostly. And lately, a fragment of a hymn." Mrs. Abernathy raised a thin eyebrow. "A children's song, you say? And a hymn? How very specific." She walked over to the piano, examining it with a keen eye. She ran her hand over the keys, then knelt, despite her age, to peer underneath. Miss Marple observed her closely. Mrs. Abernathy was not merely curious. She was investigating. She clearly suspected foul play. As she knelt, her long, elegant fingers brushed against the thick velvet curtain that concealed the space behind the piano. For a moment her eyes, usually so sharp, seemed to cloud with a distant memory. She rose slowly, a thoughtful expression on her face. "This piano," Mrs. Abernathy stated, her voice quieter now, almost contemplative, "was given to Albert's family by his grandfather. A man of deep faith he was. He had a particular fondness for that hymn, Rock of Ages. Said it comforted him in his final days. And as for the children's song, Whispering Willows, wasn't it? Albert's mother used to sing it to him. He often mentioned how it reminded him of his childhood and a certain willow tree by the creek where he played as a boy." Miss Marple felt a shiver of understanding. The clues were not random. They were profoundly personal, almost intimately so. They spoke of history, of family, and perhaps of the true intentions of the deceased. As Mrs. Abernathy straightened up, her gaze met Miss Marple's across the room. There was an unspoken recognition, an acknowledgment of shared suspicion. It was then that Mrs. Abernathy noticed something else, a small, almost imperceptible piece of thread, a tiny crimson strand, caught on one of the piano's pedals. It was a peculiar shade of red, almost like a piece of embroidery silk. She plucked it off, holding it between her fingers. "How very odd," Mrs. Abernathy murmured, examining the thread. "It seems this piano not only plays by itself, but also collects rather unusual mementos. I wonder, Mr. Fairweather, if you could tell me where this might have come from." Mr. Fairweather, who had been watching Mrs. Abernathy's every move with growing discomfort, suddenly looked as if he had seen a ghost. His ruddy face drained of color, and he stammered, unable to find a coherent reply. The tiny crimson thread, Miss Marple realized, was a fresh clue, a direct physical link to the mysterious player. Chapter 6. A Familiar Thread. The crimson thread, so casually discovered by Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy, sent a jolt of recognition through Miss Marple. She had seen that particular shade of red before, used in a certain type of embroidery. It was a shade not commonly found in dressmaking or upholstery, but rather in the intricate needlework favored by some of the village. "Ladies," Mrs. Abernathy's direct question, and Mr. Fairweather's sudden pallor created an undeniable tension in the Eves' drawing-room. Mrs. Fairweather, sensing her husband's discomfort, quickly interjected, "Oh, dear Elspeth, what a trifle! It could be from anything. Perhaps a loose thread from one of the housemaid's aprons, or from an old cushion. This house is full of such things." But Mrs. Abernathy's sharp eyes were still fixed on Mr. Fairweather. "Indeed, Eleanor, perhaps, but it is a very distinct shade. And rather sturdy, I note. It almost resembles the sort of thread one might use for fishing line, if one were so inclined to use something other than conventional tackle." Her gaze flickered meaningfully from the thread to the piano. Mr. Fairweather, composing himself with an obvious effort, forced a laugh. "Fishing line? My dear Elspeth, are you suggesting some sort of elaborate prank involving our antique piano?" He tried to sound amused, but a distinct tremor in his voice betrayed his true feelings. Miss Marple merely observed, her expression unreadable. She recognized the thread. It was identical in color and texture to the embroidery thread Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, used for her elaborate cross-stitch projects. Mrs. Higgins, she recalled, always carried a small sewing kit with her, and had a particular fondness for that deep, almost purplish crimson. Later that evening, after the Fairweathers and Mrs. Abernathy had retired for the night, Miss Marple found herself once again pondering the clues. The lullaby, Whispering Willows, a favorite of Mr. Abernathy and Clara's mother. The hymn, Rock of Ages, a comfort to Mr. Abernathy's grandfather. The fishing line, the missing will, the missing brooch, and now the crimson thread. All pieces of a puzzle. The following morning, Miss Marple embarked on a more deliberate, if still discreet, inquiry. She paid a visit to Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, ostensibly to ask for a recipe for gooseberry jam, knowing that Mrs. Higgins was renowned for hers. During their conversation in the kitchen, a cheerful room despite the undercurrent of unease at the manor, Miss Marple casually complimented Mrs. Higgins on her embroidery, which was displayed on a small side table. "Such beautiful work, Mrs. Higgins. And that crimson thread, it is a most striking shade. I don't believe I've seen its like before." Mrs. Higgins beamed, picking up a piece of her work. "Oh, thank you, Miss Marple. It's a special silk thread, this. I had it imported from a shop in London, years ago. I only use it for my finest pieces. It's so strong, you see, and doesn't fade." She held up a needle, threaded with the distinctive crimson. It was identical to the thread Mrs. Abernathy had found. "Indeed, it looks very strong," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes twinkling. "Almost strong enough to hold a rather heavy curtain, perhaps?" Mrs. Higgins chuckled. "Oh, yes, easily. Much stronger than common cotton. Why, I could probably use it to mend a fishing net if I had to." She then sighed, her expression growing troubled. "But my heart's not been in it lately, Miss Marple. Not with all the goings-on. The piano, you know. It's enough to make a body jump out of her skin." "I sympathize entirely, Mrs. Higgins," Miss Marple said gently. "It must be very unsettling to hear music from an empty room. Do you ever wonder how it might be done?" Mrs. Higgins wrung her hands. "Well, I certainly don't believe in ghosts, Miss Marple. Not truly, but I've heard things. Footsteps late at night, in the corridor outside the locked study. and sometimes a faint clicking sound just before the music starts, as if something is being wound up. And I heard Mr. Fairweather himself the other night arguing with someone in hushed tones behind the locked study door, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. Footsteps, a clicking sound, and a hushed argument behind the locked study door. This was invaluable. The locked study was adjacent to the drawing room where the piano resided. The fishing line, Clara had observed, disappeared into the wall behind the piano, presumably into that very study. Miss Marple finished her tea, thanked Mrs. Higgins for the recipe, and took her leave. She now had a very strong suspicion as to the identity of the person who had rigged the piano, or at least provided the means. It was Mrs. Higgins, the seemingly nervous but secretly resourceful housekeeper, who possessed the unique thread and had access to the entire house. But was she the perpetrator, or merely an unwitting accomplice, or perhaps a desperate individual trying to send a message of her own? The image of Mr. Fairweather searching near the old shed, his sudden alarm when the piano played, and the subsequent hurried return to the house, flashed in Miss Marple's mind. He was clearly reacting to the music, not initiating it. This suggested that the player of the piano was not Mr. Fairweather, but someone else, someone perhaps trying to expose him or communicating with him in a clandestine manner. As she walked home, Miss Marple considered another possibility. If the will was missing, and Mrs. Fairweather was the beneficiary under the old will, who would benefit from the new will? And why would the piano play a message relating to Mr. Abernathy's past? Her thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the sound of a distant crash, followed by a woman's terrified scream from the direction of Willow Creek Manor. The sound carried clearly on the still afternoon air, a cry of genuine terror. Something had gone terribly wrong at the manor, and the mystery of the piano was about to take a far more dangerous turn. Chapter 7. A Cry for Help. The scream, piercing the quiet afternoon, brought an immediate halt to village life. Doors flew open, and worried faces peered out. Miss Marple, despite her age, quickened her pace, her heart quickening with a grim premonition. The sound had come distinctly from Willow Creek Manor. Within minutes, a small cluster of villagers, including Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry, were hurrying towards the manor. Miss Marple, ever observant, noticed the Fairweathers' new gardener, Perkins, rushing from the back of the property, his face pale with alarm. They found Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, in a state of hysterics in the manor's grand hall. She was pointing a trembling finger towards the drawing-room. "The piano! Oh, the piano!" And Mrs. Fairweather, "She's fallen!" Bursting into the drawing-room, they found Mrs. Fairweather lying prone on the polished floorboards amidst a scattering of sheet music. Her head lay at an awkward angle, and a small pool of blood was forming near her temple. She was unconscious. The grand piano stood silently, an imposing dark sentinel in the corner, its lid still closed. Mr. Fairweather rushed to his wife's side, his bluster replaced by genuine terror. "Eleanor! My God, what has happened?" He knelt, frantically trying to rouse her. Dr. Haydock, ever calm and efficient, immediately took charge. He gently examined Mrs. Fairweather, checking her pulse and pupils. "She sustained a nasty blow to the head, Alistair. I suspect she simply fainted and fell. We must get her to her bed at once and send for a nurse." Clara Meredith appeared in the doorway, her face ashen, Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy just behind her, her expression grim and unyielding. "I heard the scream," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I was in the garden." "What happened?" Mrs. Higgins, still sobbing, managed to stammer out, "I heard the piano, ma'am." It began to play again, that awful lullaby. And then Mrs. Fairweather, she let out a shriek, and then a crash. "I came running, and there she was." "The piano again?" Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Playing by itself in broad daylight, even as someone is injured? How very convenient." Her eyes narrowed as she looked pointedly at Mr. Fairweather, who was cradling his wife's head. Miss Marple, while concerned for Mrs. Fairweather, noticed several things. The sheet music scattered on the floor was not the Whispering Willow's lullaby, but a more complex classical piece. And the grand piano, while silent now, had a strange, almost imperceptible tremor in its leg, as if it had recently been moved or disturbed. Her gaze went to the precise spot where she had seen the discoloration on the floorboards beneath the piano's corner leg. It seemed to have shifted slightly. Did anyone else see or hear anything before Mrs. Fairweather's fall? Dr. Haydock asked, as Colonel Bantry and Perkins carefully lifted Mrs. Fairweather onto a makeshift stretcher. "I was upstairs packing some things," Clara offered. "I heard the lullaby start and then a crash and the scream. I thought it was just Aunt Eleanor's nerves acting up again." Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy, who had been quietly examining the room, now spoke. "I was in the library on the other side of the hall. I heard the lullaby, yes. And then, quite distinctly, a sharp, metallic click. Only a second before the scream. A metallic click." Miss Marple connected this with Mrs. Higgins's earlier mention of a clicking sound just before the music starts. This was not a ghost. It was a mechanism. And now this mechanism seemed to have caused an injury. "I think," Mrs. Abernathy continued, her voice cold, "that this playing by itself is far more than a simple quirk of an old house. And I believe it is directly related to my cousin Albert's missing will." She looked directly at Mr. Fairweather. Mr. Fairweather flinched, his face darkening with a mixture of fear and anger. "Elspeth, how dare you? My wife is gravely injured, and you accuse me of—" "What, exactly?" "Conspiring with the piano." "I accuse you of nothing, Alistair," Mrs. Abernathy retorted, "save perhaps of a distinct lack of candor. This house is full of secrets, and your wife's injury may well be a part of them." Dr. Haydock, concerned with the immediate medical emergency, interceded. "Let us attend to Mrs. Fairweather first. Any further investigations can wait." As Mrs. Fairweather was carried away, Miss Marple took a moment to subtly observe the drawing-room again. Her eyes fell upon the piano. Near the base of the pedal lyre, where the fishing line had presumably been attached, there was a faint but distinct groove, almost a fresh indentation in the wood. It was small, but consistent with repeated tension from a thin, strong cord. She also noticed something else, something lying almost entirely hidden beneath the thick carpet, close to where Mrs. Fairweather had fallen. It was a single, small, highly polished metal sphere, no larger than a marble, but quite heavy. It seemed to have rolled from beneath the piano. She quickly nudged it with her foot, covering it partially with the edge of the carpet, hoping no one else would see it. The fall of Mrs. Fairweather was no accident. The piano music, the metallic click, the groove on the piano, and now this small, heavy sphere. These were not random events. Someone had deliberately set a trap, and Mrs. Fairweather had walked straight into it. The music had not been a cry for help from the victim, but a lure. And the victim might not have been Mrs. Fairweather at all, but someone else entirely. The small, heavy sphere, glinting beneath the carpet, was a crucial piece of evidence, pointing to a much more elaborate and dangerous mechanism. Chapter 8. The Weight of Evidence. Mrs. Fairweather's injury, while serious, was thankfully not fatal. Dr. Haydock reported that she had sustained a concussion and a deep cut to the scalp, but would recover. However, she remained unconscious for several hours, and when she did eventually awaken, she was disoriented and unable to provide a clear account of what had happened. She remembered only the music, a sudden startle, and then darkness. The police, in the form of the local Constable Hemlock, were called. Constable Hemlock was a good, if somewhat unimaginative, officer, and his initial assessment, after a cursory glance, was that Mrs. Fairweather had fainted due to stress and struck her head on the piano. He found no evidence of foul play beyond the lingering atmosphere of unease in the house. The villagers, however, were not so easily convinced, and the tales of the haunted piano grew even more colorful. Miss Marple, however, knew better. She had secured the small, polished metal sphere she had found beneath the carpet. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, perfectly round, and gleamed with a dull, almost antique luster. It felt cool and smooth to the touch, and there was a small, almost invisible loop on one side, as if it had once been attached to something. She examined it closely at home, comparing it to various objects from her own household. It resembled nothing so much as a small, precision-engineered counterweight, or perhaps part of a very old clock mechanism. Its presence under the piano, coupled with Clara's observation of a fishing line and Mrs. Abernathy's mention of a metallic click, painted a clear picture in Miss Marple's mind. The piano was not merely being played by a fishing line. It was being played by an intricate remote mechanism, likely triggered from the locked study, using a combination of the fishing line and this small, heavy sphere as a counterweight or release mechanism. The clicking sound Mrs. Higgins had mentioned was the sound of this device being activated. The next day, Miss Marple paid another visit to Mrs. Higgins, ostensibly to deliver a jar of her homemade raspberry jam. She found the housekeeper looking even more distraught than before. "Oh, Miss Marple, this place is getting too much for me. Mrs. Fairweather hurt, and the constable looking at me like I might have something to do with it." Miss Marple offered a sympathetic ear. "Nonsense, Mrs. Higgins. You are merely a witness to unfortunate events. Tell me, do you recall anything at all from the day Mrs. Fairweather fell? Anything unusual, perhaps, in the locked study?" Mrs. Higgins wrung her hands. "Well, I did notice something peculiar. Just an hour or so before the accident, I was dusting in the hall, and the door to Mr. Fairweather's study, which is always kept locked, was slightly ajar. Only for a moment, mind. I caught a glimpse of Mr. Fairweather inside. He was bending over a table near the wall where the piano sits, fussing with something small. And he seemed to be holding a coil of that crimson thread, just like the one I use for my embroidery. I thought it odd, him taking an interest in sewing. But I said nothing. This was a crucial piece of information. Mr. Fairweather, the crimson thread, the locked study, the table by the wall where the piano sat. It all clicked into place. Mr. Fairweather was involved, but not as the player of the piano itself. He was setting or checking the mechanism. "Did you see anything else, Mrs. Higgins?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but insistent. Mrs. Higgins hesitated. "Well, there was one more thing. I heard him mutter something. He said, 'There, that should bring her out.' He was talking to himself, I think, and he sounded very grim, not like his usual self at all. 'There, that should bring her out.'" This chilling phrase, uttered by Mr. Fairweather just before the piano played and his wife fell, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. This was not a random accident. It was a deliberate act designed to lure someone, presumably Mrs. Fairweather, into the drawing room. But for what purpose? To injure her? Or to retrieve something? Miss Marple reflected on the missing brooch. Was it possible that the brooch was not simply lost, but deliberately removed to create a pretext for Mrs. Fairweather to search the drawing room? And if so, what was the true target of Mr. Fairweather's machinations? She also considered Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy's sudden arrival. She was a keen observer and clearly suspicious of the Fairweathers. Could Mr. Fairweather have been attempting to retrieve the missing will, or some other crucial document, before Mrs. Abernathy's keen eye could discover it? Miss Marple's mind returned to the hymns and lullabies. Whispering Willows and Rock of Ages? These were not random tunes. They were personal to the late Mr. Abernathy and his family. Could they be a code, a map, a hint to where the missing will was hidden? That evening, as the shadows lengthened over Willow Creek Manor, Miss Marple noticed something else. A flicker of light in Mr. Fairweather's locked study. Not the steady glow of a lamp, but a quick, almost frantic flash, as if someone was moving rapidly, holding a small light. And then, a moment later, a faint clinking sound, like metal on stone, carried across the quiet evening air. The clues were accumulating, pointing towards a desperate man and a hidden secret. The piano played by itself, not as a ghost, but as a deliberate and dangerous instrument of deception, guided by a hand driven by greed and perhaps by fear. But the nature of the immediate danger, and the true target of Mr. Fairweather's latest attempt, remained tantalizingly just out of reach. Chapter 9. The Code Revealed. The clinking sound from Mr. Fairweather's study, combined with his earlier muttered phrase, weighed heavily on Miss Marple's mind. There, that should bring her out. It suggested a calculated trap. And the metal sphere, the fishing line, Mrs. Higgins's thread, all pointed to a carefully constructed mechanism. Miss Marple recalled the missing brooch and the sheet music found scattered near Mrs. Fairweather. The music was a complex classical piece, not the lullaby. This indicated that Mrs. Fairweather had not been responding to the lullaby, but perhaps to a perceived loss of her brooch. This, Miss Marple surmised, was the lure. The piano music was merely a distraction, or perhaps a warning to the perpetrator that his trap had been sprung. She decided to revisit Clara Meredith, knowing the young woman's sharp mind might hold the key to the musical code. She found Clara in the Manor's garden, sketching. "My dear," Miss Marple began gently, "I have been pondering those tunes the piano plays. The lullaby, Whispering Willows, and the hymn, Rock of Ages. You mentioned they were significant to Mr. Abernathy and his family. Do they perhaps hold any other meaning?" Clara frowned, thinking deeply. "Well, Whispering Willows was my mother's favorite. She'd sing it to me as a child. And she often told me that old Mr. Abernathy loved that particular willow tree down by the creek, near the old mill. He spent hours there, fishing, and sometimes, she said, he'd hide things in its hollow trunk, small treasures. Childhood secrets, you know." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed.
"A hollow trunk!"
"And what of Rock of Ages?" "That hymn," Clara continued, "my mother said Mr. Abernathy's grandfather always used to hum it when he was in his study, particularly when he was working at his old roll-top desk. He was a very religious man, and he'd tap his fingers on the desk to the rhythm." Miss Marple felt a profound sense of revelation. The pieces clicked into place with satisfying precision. The piano wasn't playing a general ghost message. It was a precise coded message left by Mr. Abernathy himself, or someone who knew his habits intimately. Whispering Willows. The willow tree by the creek and its hollow trunk. This was likely the location of the new will, or perhaps a clue to its whereabouts. Rock of Ages, the roll-top desk in the study. This too could be a hiding place or a clue. The 3 taps that punctuated the music. Perhaps a specific rhythm or a number. "Miss Meredith," Miss Marple said, her voice unusually firm, "I believe these tunes are not merely sentimental memories, but a map. A map to where Mr. Abernathy concealed his final wishes." Clara gasped, her eyes widening. "You mean the new will?" "Precisely," Miss Marple confirmed, "and someone else has realized this too. Someone who has now constructed this elaborate mechanism to play these specific tunes. And that someone, I suspect, is Mr. Fairweather." Clara looked horrified. "Uncle Alistair? But why?" "Because, my dear, if the new will is found, and it supersedes the old one, then he and Mrs. Fairweather stand to lose their inheritance of Willow Creek Manor and any associated fortune. He would have every motive to find and destroy it, or to prevent anyone else from doing so." Miss Marple then recounted Mrs. Higgins's testimony of Mr. Fairweather's hushed words and his fussing with the crimson thread in the study. "But what about Aunt Eleanor's fall?" Clara whispered, visibly shaken. Did he mean to hurt her?" "That I'm not yet entirely certain of," Miss Marple admitted. "But the small metal sphere I observed, along with the groove on the piano, suggests a trap of some sort. Perhaps he intended to lure her into the room to witness him discovering the will, or to distract her while he searched. Or perhaps the trap was meant for someone else entirely." Her thoughts drifted to Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy, a woman who posed a significant threat to Mr. Fairweather's plans. That evening a thick fog rolled in, blanketing St. Mary Mead in an eerie silence. Miss Marple, unable to shake off a sense of impending danger, resolved to act. She knew that Mr. Fairweather, now aware of Mrs. Abernathy's suspicions and perhaps his wife's imminent recovery, would be desperate to secure the will or destroy it. As the village clock struck 10, a faint sound reached Miss Marple's ears, muffled by the fog, the soft, melancholic strains of Whispering Willows, followed by the distinct 3 taps. But this time the music seemed more urgent, almost frantic. And then, quite clearly, 3 discordant, harsh chords, hammered out with a violent intensity, followed by a sudden, jarring silence. This was not the usual controlled mechanism. This was a direct manual intervention. Someone was at the piano playing it with a desperate hand, and it seemed the message had shifted from a code to a warning, or perhaps a desperate plea. Miss Marple rose, retrieving her stout walking stick and a small, powerful lantern. She knew with absolute certainty that tonight the truth of the piano and the missing will would finally come to light. And she had a very strong suspicion that the discordant chords were a signal of distress from someone who had finally discovered the truth and was now in grave danger. Chapter 10. The Desperate Search. The discordant chords breaking the fog-laden silence were a stark call to action. Miss Marple, despite the late hour and the thickening mist, knew she could not wait until morning. Someone was in danger, or a crucial piece of evidence was about to be destroyed. She walked briskly towards Willow Creek Manor, her small lantern cutting a narrow swathe through the swirling fog. The manor loomed ahead, a dark, silent hulk. All the lights were out, save for a single lamp glowing faintly in Mrs. Fairweather's upstairs bedroom. As she approached the drawing-room windows, shrouded by the heavy fog, she saw a flicker of movement within. A shadow, tall and angular, passed quickly before the grand piano. It was not the steady movement of someone setting a mechanism, but the furtive, agitated motion of someone searching. Miss Marple crept closer, discerning a faint muffled sound from within, a rustling, and then a distinct groan, as if something heavy was being moved. She also caught a glimpse of Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy's figure, now clearly visible through the fog, standing near the drawing-room door, listening intently. Just as Miss Marple reached the porch, Mrs. Abernathy turned, startling her. "Miss Marple, what on earth are you doing out at this hour?" "The piano, Mrs. Abernathy," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm despite the urgency she felt. "It played a most unusual coda just now. I fear something untoward is afoot." Mrs. Abernathy nodded grimly. "Indeed, I heard it too. And then just now I heard a thud. I believe Mr. Fairweather is in the drawing-room, and I also believe he is not alone." She gestured towards the door. "I tried the handle, but it's locked from the inside." This confirmed Miss Marple's fears. Mr. Fairweather was indeed acting. And if he wasn't alone, who was with him? "The study, Mrs. Abernathy," Miss Marple suggested, pointing to the adjacent room. "The fishing line, remember? And Mrs. Higgins mentioned a clicking sound. I suspect the mechanism is operated from there." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes widened with understanding. Together they moved silently to the study door. It, too, was locked, but Mrs. Abernathy, with surprising strength, tested the handle and then put her ear to the wood. "I hear muffled voices," she whispered, "and a scraping sound, as if something heavy is being dragged." Miss Marple then noticed something else, a small but undeniable scratch mark on the polished wood floor of the hallway, near the study door. It was faint, but consistent with a key being forced into the lock, or perhaps dropped and scraped. And caught in the intricate pattern of the scratch, a tiny fragment of dark, almost black thread. Not the crimson embroidery silk, but something thicker, coarser. Then a sudden muffled shout from within the study, followed by a crash. "We must get in," Mrs. Abernathy declared, desperation in her voice. "Someone is in danger?" Just then the front door of Willow Creek Manor creaked open, and Clara Meredith, dressed in a nightgown and clutching a candlestick, peered out, her face pale. "I heard the noise." "Is everything all right?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice low and steady. "I fear it is not. Mr. Fairweather is in the study, and I believe he has found what he was looking for. But it seems he has had company." At that very moment a distinct, high-pitched whimper emanated from within the drawing-room, followed by a low growl. It was Perkins the gardener's dog, Pip, who often wandered around the house at night. Pip was known for his gentle nature. A growl from him was a sure sign of trouble. "The window!" Miss Marple exclaimed, remembering the large bay window in the drawing-room, which was known to be old and occasionally left unlatched for air. Quickly through the garden, the three women hurried around the side of the house, battling the thick fog. They reached the drawing-room window, and Miss Marple, with an unexpected surge of strength, pushed it open. The scene within was one of utter chaos. Mr. Fairweather was on his knees by the grand piano, frantically tearing at the floorboards directly beneath it. He had managed to pry up a section of the ornate skirting, revealing a dark recess beneath. He held a small, leather-bound document in his hand, his face a mask of triumph and desperation. But he was not alone. Standing over him, a heavy brass poker clutched menacingly in his hand, was Perkins the gardener. And on the floor dazed lay Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, a small dark bundle of what looked like the crimson embroidery thread clutched in her hand. Little Pip stood guard over her, growling at Perkins. "Stop him!" Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy cried out, rushing into the room. Perkins, startled by their sudden entry, dropped the poker. He lunged for Mr. Fairweather, attempting to snatch the document.
"The will!"
Mr. Fairweather shrieked, clutching it to his chest. "It's here!" He hid it here. Miss Marple, surveying the scene, knew the full truth was about to unfold. Perkins, the gardener, a man ostensibly hired by the Fairweathers, was involved. He was not a witness but a central player, and the piano that played by itself had been the key, not just to a missing will, but to a deeper, more treacherous secret. Chapter 11. The Web Unravels. The drawing-room of Willow Creek Manor was a tableau of accusation and confusion, as Constable Hemlock, alerted by a now fully recovered Mrs. Fairweather and a panicking Clara Meredith, arrived on the scene. Mr. Fairweather, still clutching the leather-bound document, was incoherent with rage, pointing at Perkins the gardener, who stood sullenly by the wall. Mrs. Higgins, shaken but conscious, sat on a chair, Pip still growling softly by her feet. Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy and Miss Marple stood calmly, their expressions grave. "Now what in blazes is going on here?" Constable Hemlock demanded, looking from one agitated face to another. "This man," Mr. Fairweather spluttered, holding up the document. "This ruffian. He attacked me, and he was about to steal this. The will. The true will of Albert Abernathy." Perkins scoffed. "I saw him digging like a madman. I heard him from the garden." "He was destroying it, Constable." "Trying to burn it in the hearth. That will would ruin him." Constable Hemlock, thoroughly bewildered, turned to Miss Marple, a silent plea for clarity in his eyes. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice clear and composed amidst the chaos. "Constable, if I may offer a concise explanation, the piano, you see, did not truly play by itself. It was operated by a clever, albeit simple, mechanism. A fishing line, provided by Mrs. Higgins's strong embroidery thread, was attached to the piano's key mechanism, specifically to the damper pedals. This line was then fed through a small hole in the wall, behind the velvet curtains, and into the adjacent study." She paused, allowing this information to sink in. In the study, this line was attached to a timer, a rather old and ingenious device that released a weighted mechanism, a small metal sphere, such as this one. Miss Marple produced the sphere from her reticule, which, when released, would pull the fishing line, causing the piano to play specific notes, or even a short tune. Constable Hemlock eyed the sphere with suspicion. "And who rigged this contraption, Miss Marple?" "The original mechanism, I believe, was set up by the late Mr. Abernathy himself," Miss Marple stated, her voice carrying an air of quiet authority. "He was, by all accounts, an eccentric man, a scholar who enjoyed riddles. He made a new will just before his passing, intending to leave a substantial portion of his estate to a neglected charity and a distant, struggling relative, not Mrs. Fairweather, who was already well provided for by her own means." Mr. Fairweather's face turned crimson. "Lies, slander." "This new will," Miss Marple continued, undeterred, "Mr. Abernathy, foreseeing potential attempts to suppress it, hid it. He devised the piano mechanism as a clue, a sort of musical breadcrumb trail, to guide the right person to its location. The Whispering Willow's lullaby pointed to the willow tree by the creek where he played as a boy, a place where he often hid treasures. The Rock of Ages hymn referred to the roll-top desk in his study, and the 3 taps indicated a specific sequence or perhaps a depth. But the new will was not at the willow tree or the desk," Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy interjected, her eyes on the opened floorboards beneath the piano. "Precisely," Miss Marple affirmed. Mr. Abernathy knew that the obvious hiding places might be searched first. Therefore the true hiding place was a step beyond the clues. The combined message of Whispering Willows, the willow, a source of his childhood secrets, and Rock of Ages, his grandfather's study, where he tapped on his desk, was not to find the will in those places, but to connect them to the piano itself, an instrument so central to the family's musical history. He hid it in a secret compartment beneath the very foundation of the piano, a final clever flourish, perhaps hoping its ghostly playing would eventually draw attention to its base. Miss Marple then looked directly at Mr. Fairweather. When Mr. Fairweather discovered the original will was missing, and that the manor and fortune would revert to his wife under the old will, he understood the grave threat posed by this new will. He also understood the coded nature of the piano's playing, or, at least, he came to suspect it was a clue. He reactivated the mechanism, Constable, Miss Marple continued, using Mrs. Higgins' unique crimson embroidery thread which he stole from her sewing kit. He set the timer to play the old tunes, hoping to lure the new will's beneficiary into revealing themselves, or to draw attention away from his own search. He had hoped to find the will first, and destroy it. That's when Mrs. Fairweather was injured, Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy added, her voice chilling. A deliberate act, I believe, to create a diversion, perhaps to search the room unnoticed, or even to eliminate her as a potential witness if she began to suspect his intentions. Not entirely to eliminate her, Mrs. Abernathy, Miss Marple corrected gently. I believe Mr. Fairweather's intent was to injure, to disorient, and to remove her from the immediate vicinity. He muttered, "There, that should bring her out." He was setting a trap to get her out of the drawing-room, or perhaps to keep her confined to her bed while he searched more freely. He used the missing brooch as a lure, knowing Mrs. Fairweather would search the room diligently. And the missing will, it was hidden here, beneath the piano, Miss Marple concluded, gesturing to the open floorboards. Mr. Fairweather had almost found it when Perkins entered the room. All eyes turned to Perkins. "And what was your role in all this, Mr. Perkins?" Constable Hemlock asked sternly. Perkins finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I saw him, Constable. I saw him moving about the study late at night, and heard the music. I knew old Mr. Abernathy had been kind to my family in the past. He had a soft spot for my children. I suspected Mr. Fairweather was up to no good. I overheard snippets of conversation, too, about the will. And I saw him taking Mrs. Higgins' thread. I used my own key to the study, which Mr. Abernathy had given me for garden tools, to look through the study window. I saw the fishing line and the counterweight. I understood. I played the piano manually tonight after seeing Mr. Fairweather tampering with the floorboards. I was trying to alert the house to stop him from destroying the true will, as he was clearly attempting to do." Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. Perkins was attempting to create an alarm. The discordant chords were a desperate cry for help, a warning that the truth was about to be obliterated. He, too, understood the code, having known Mr. Abernathy for years. He knew the true beneficiary was a struggling, distant relative, a Miss Penelope Croft, and a local orphanage. Constable Hemlock looked at Mr. Fairweather, who had slumped, defeated, against the piano. "So, Mr. Fairweather, you sought to destroy this will, making your wife the sole beneficiary of Mr. Abernathy's fortune by suppressing his true wishes?" Mr. Fairweather merely buried his face in his hands. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle ticking of the mantelpiece clock. The elaborate deception of the piano that played by itself was now revealed to be a desperate act of greed. Chapter 12. Motive and Morale. The full truth, once unveiled, settled upon Willow Creek Manor with the finality of a closing chord. Mr. Alistair Fairweather, driven by avarice and a profound sense of entitlement, had indeed reactivated the late Mr. Abernathy's ingenious piano mechanism. His intention was to find the hidden will before anyone else, particularly the perceptive Mrs. Elspeth Abernathy, could unearth it and then destroy it, ensuring his wife, Eleanor, remained the sole heir under the previous, less restrictive will. Constable Hemlock, now fully comprehending the layers of deceit, placed Mr. Fairweather under arrest. The discovery of the new will, clearly dated and witnessed, left no room for doubt. It indeed bequeathed Willow Creek Manor to a local orphanage and the bulk of Mr. Abernathy's remaining fortune to a distant, impoverished cousin, Miss Penelope Croft, a woman Mr. Abernathy had quietly supported in secret for years. The will also contained a poignant note from Mr. Abernathy, explaining his use of the piano and its coded tunes as a final, playful yet serious riddle for those who truly understood him. Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, was cleared of any wrongdoing, having merely been a source of the crimson thread and an unwitting witness to Mr. Fairweather's furtive activities. Her clicking sound observation and Mr. Fairweather's muttered phrase became crucial corroborating evidence. Clara Meredith, initially horrified by her uncle's actions, found solace in the truth and a new sense of purpose in ensuring Mr. Abernathy's true wishes were honored. Perkins, the gardener, was commended for his courage and sharp instincts. He had long suspected Mr. Fairweather's ill intentions and had acted bravely to prevent the destruction of the will. His knowledge of Mr. Abernathy's past kindness had spurred him to risk his own safety. As for Mrs. Fairweather, she eventually recovered physically, but the emotional blow of her husband's betrayal left her deeply shaken. She retreated from St. Mary Mead, unable to face the quiet judgment of the village, and sought refuge with distant relatives, a broken woman, the unwitting pawn in her husband's greedy game. Miss Jane Marple, in the quiet aftermath, reflected on the case. It was a classic tale of human frailty, of greed eclipsing decency, and of the subtle yet powerful forces that drive individuals to deception. Mr. Abernathy's genius had been to recognize the avarice in those around him and to construct a final musical riddle, knowing that only someone with true understanding and patience would decipher it. The piano that played by itself was not a ghost but a guardian, whispering truths from beyond the grave. The moral, as Miss Marple observed to Dr. Haydock over a cup of tea a few days later, was clear. It is often the quietest souls, doctor, who hold the deepest secrets. And the most seemingly ordinary objects, when viewed with a discerning eye and a compassionate heart, can reveal the most extraordinary tales of human nature. Greed, like a discordant note, always seeks to disrupt harmony, but truth, like a pure melody, will always find a way to be heard. The orphanage, revitalized by Mr. Abernathy's generosity, flourished, providing a safe haven for many children. Miss Penelope Croft, finally relieved of her financial burdens, established a small music school in London, honoring the man who had, even in death, looked out for her. Willow Creek Manor, eventually sold, found a new owner who cherished its history, and the grand piano, its mystery solved, once again filled its rooms with joyous, unspectral music. And Miss Jane Marple returned to her knitting, her garden, and her quiet observations, ever ready for the next puzzle that the deceptively serene landscape of St. Mary Mead might present. The world, she knew, was full of such pianos, waiting for someone to listen. If you've enjoyed our journey through mystery so far, do stay with Miss Marple until the very end, for her keen eye and understanding heart always uncover the truth no matter